The storm did not arrive as a single explosive moment, but as a slow, suffocating collapse of everything that once felt controlled, and this time it struck Genoa City with a brutality that left no one untouched. When Audra Charles was found dead under circumstances so disturbingly ambiguous that even silence seemed to carry accusations, her life ending at the exact moment she stood on the verge of revealing the truth about a pregnancy that had the power to shatter emotional bonds, destabilize alliances, and redraw the fragile lines of power within the Newman family, turning what should have been a revelation into a void filled with suspicion, fear, and irreversible consequences. And in that void, Noah Newman found himself standing alone, overwhelmed not only by grief, but by a haunting echo of Audra's final words, words that refused to settle into clarity and instead twisted themselves into fragments of guilt, doubt, and paranoia, until he could no longer tell whether he was mourning her or being judged by her memory, and that psychological unraveling became the very thing that made him vulnerable, not just to the scrutiny of others, but to forces already in motion long before Audra's death. The shock spread quickly, not as sympathy but as suspicion, because nothing about Audra's death aligned with the simplicity of an accident, and the timing was far too precise to ignore, forcing investigators to consider the possibility of a calculated act, a deliberate silencing of a woman who knew too much. And in that narrative, Noah became the most convenient suspect, not necessarily because there was undeniable proof, but because his proximity to Audra, his emotional volatility, and the inconsistencies in his recollections created a portrait that was dangerously easy to interpret as guilt, a portrait that began to solidify in the eyes of the police, the public, and even those closest to him, turning every hesitation in his voice and every lapse in his memory into evidence against him, until the truth itself seemed less important than the story being constructed around him. Nick Newman stepped forward with the instinctive determination of a father who refused to let his son be destroyed by speculation. Yet beneath that fierce protection lay a fracture he could not ignore, a growing awareness that Noah was not telling him everything, not necessarily out of malice, but out of fear, and that realization created a silent tension between them, one that eroded trust with each passing moment, because Nick understood too well the legacy of secrets within his family, the way hidden truths had a way of resurfacing at the worst possible time. And as he watched Noah struggle, he began to question not just what had happened to Audra, but what his own son might be capable of hiding, and whether protecting him meant standing by his side or forcing him to confront something he was desperately trying to bury. Meanwhile, Victor Newman observed the unfolding chaos not as a grieving patriarch, but as a strategist evaluating a shifting battlefield, recognizing in Audra's death an opportunity as much as a threat, because in a world where information equaled power, the absence of truth could be just as valuable as its revelation. And Victor had built his empire on precisely that understanding, on the ability to control narratives, manipulate perceptions, and ensure that whatever truth eventually surfaced would do so on his terms, and if that required sacrificing reputations, relationships, or even members of his own family, it was a cost he had long ago accepted as necessary, a philosophy that cast a long shadow over every decision being made in the aftermath of Audra's death. The investigation took a darker turn when a shocking lead emerged, revealing that Audra had secretly met with an unidentified man shortly before she died, a detail that shattered the illusion of a contained tragedy and expanded the scope of suspicion into something far more dangerous, suggesting that Audra had been entangled in a web of alliances and conflicts that extended beyond the personal and into the realm of calculated ambition, where every relationship carried hidden motives and every interaction could be part of a larger design. And the possibility that her pregnancy was connected to this unknown figure introduced a new layer of complexity, raising questions not only about who the father might be, but about who stood to gain from keeping that truth buried, permanently if necessary. Driven by desperation and a need to reclaim control over his own narrative, Noah made the reckless decision to conduct his own investigation, convinced that the truth would clear his name. Yet with each discovery, he found himself drawn deeper into a labyrinth of half-truths and deliberate misdirection, where every answer led to more questions, and every clue seemed to implicate him further, as though the path he was following had been carefully constructed to guide him toward a predetermined outcome. And the most terrifying realization was not that he might fail to prove his innocence, but that he might have been positioned from the very beginning as a scapegoat, a convenient figure whose downfall would serve to protect something far more significant. And that possibility began to erode his sense of self, forcing him to confront the unsettling idea that even his own memories might not be entirely reliable. As the layers of Audra's life were peeled back, the image that emerged was far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, revealing a woman who had navigated power with calculated precision, who had formed alliances not out of loyalty but out of necessity, and who had accumulated enemies as a consequence of her relentless ambition, each secret uncovered adding another thread to a network of intrigue that extended through Genoa City's most influential circles, suggesting that her death was not an isolated event but a catalyst, a spark that threatened to ignite conflicts that had been quietly building beneath the surface, conflicts that could no longer remain hidden once the truth began to surface. The deeper Noah dug, the more he realized that Audra's secrets were not just about her, but about everyone connected to her, including himself. And that realization forced him into a confrontation with his own actions, his own decisions, and the possibility that he had been manipulated into playing a role in something he never fully understood, a role that now placed him at the center of a narrative he could neither control nor escape. And as that pressure intensified, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, feeding the suspicions already surrounding him and pushing him closer to the edge of collapse, where the line between innocence and guilt blurred into something indistinguishable. Nick found himself caught in an impossible position, torn between defending his son and confronting the reality that doing so might mean ignoring truths that could ultimately destroy them both, while Victor continued to operate in the shadows, quietly shaping outcomes, ensuring that whatever resolution emerged would reinforce his authority rather than diminish it. And in that environment, trust became a liability, a weakness that could be exploited by anyone willing to manipulate it, leaving every character isolated within their own fears and motivations, unable to fully rely on anyone else. What made the situation truly unbearable was not the uncertainty of who was responsible for Audra's death, but the growing awareness that the answer might not bring closure, because in a world defined by ambition, betrayal, and carefully constructed illusions, the truth was rarely a clean resolution, but rather another layer of complication, another catalyst for conflict. And as Genoa City edged closer to that truth, the fragile balance that had kept its most powerful families intact began to fracture, revealing a reality where survival depended not on innocence, but on the ability to navigate a landscape where morality had long since been replaced by strategy. In the end, Audra's death ceased to be just a mystery and became something far more unsettling, a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of everyone involved, forcing each of them to confront the choices they had made and the consequences they could no longer avoid. And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, it became clear that the real danger was not the identity of the person who had orchestrated her death, but the realization that no one in this story was entirely innocent, and that the truth, when it finally emerged, would not save them, but instead expose them to a level of devastation from which there would be no easy recovery, leaving behind a city forever changed by the quote-unquote secrets it could no longer contain.